Welcome to the Rideshare Guy podcast, where you will learn about the rideshare and mobility industry straight from Harry Campbell, who's got over 5 years experience covering the industry and has talked to thousands of drivers. There's no better place to stay up to date, entertained, and educated. So let's dive in.
So Blair Schlecter is Vice President of Economic Development and Government Affairs for the Beverly Hills Chamber of Commerce. He's spoken and written about transportation policy and innovation issues, including the impact of new technology on our society in forums including Commotion LA, It's California, NO Transportation Weekly, and Thinking Highways magazine. And he also serves as a consultant and advisor to many companies in the mobility space. So Blair, how are you doing today?
Doing great. Great to be here, Harry.
Yeah, I'm excited to have you on and talk about the project that we recently worked on together. But before we dive in, I am curious to ask you, what's your favorite mode of transportation these days?
I guess I would say train, subway. I've always been kind of into trains and kind of like how quickly and efficiently they get you somewhere. So that would be, I guess if I had to pick one, that would be it.
Got it. So are we talking trains, though, or subways? Because they're sort of different, right?
Yeah, you know what? That's a good point. I guess I would say subway because I'm living in an area where there's really not trains. So, subway. Let's say subway.
Okay, very cool. Awesome. So I am curious to know, since you do have a day job working at the Beverly Hills Chamber of Commerce, but it sounds like you sort of dabble in transportation, at least according to the bio that I read off. What kind of got you interested in transportation policy and technology in the first place?
Yeah, I think it started a few years back when I saw first the growth in kind of the transportation system here in LA, where for a long time there wasn't much alternative but the car, and now over time our transit system's expanding. So that was one thing, and then the other thing became obviously there's been a lot of innovation in the transportation space in the last 5 years, and so I became fascinated about how you move people around. How people get connected, what's the best way to move people from A to B and to do so they can achieve whatever they want, whether it's getting to work or having a more relaxing experience traveling.
Got it. So is this sort of a side gig for you, or how does it fit in? Does it fit in at all to your day job?
Yeah, and there's actually a lot of transportation work occurring here in our area. There's a subway.
Yeah, that's right.
To Beverly Hills. The city's working on a complete streets plan, which is looking at all different forms of transportation. The city recently looked at scooters and other mobility and how that might fit into what the city's doing already. So there's actually a ton of transportation activities going on here.
Very cool. Yeah, no, it does seem like I think one of the things that stood out to me when we first met and started chatting is that you do sort of come from a unique background of having done this actual work on the government side and then mixing that with sort of your passion for transportation and kind of like you were talking about all these new modes and figuring out how that all can blend together, right?
Yeah, exactly. I've sort of straddled the line between business and government, and that's obviously a key for a lot of transportation sectors, especially like micromobility and TNCs as well.
Yeah.
And so I've kind of seen both sides, the government perspective and then also the business side of things.
Very cool. Yeah. So, I think obviously the main reason why I wanted to have you on was talk about this report that we both really, co-authored around congestion at I guess I'll read off the official title. It was Congestion at the Curb, an analysis of ride-hailing at LAX and recommendations to optimize the TNC system at airports. So, I think you and I have been working closely on this for a few months now, and it kind of, when I was getting ready for this podcast, it made me think back. I don't really remember the time before we were working on it. do you sort of remember kind of how we? How I think I reached out to you about working on this, but do you remember what you thought when I first came to you with this idea?
Yeah, I think it was in around October, right, maybe at the end of October, right when LAX had TNCs, Uber and Lyft, and other transportation network companies dropping off and picking up passengers at the curb. And they were making this transition to an off-site location called LAX. And you'd reached out, and we sort of chatted about this idea. And I thought, well, this is actually really fascinating because as I looked into it a little more, I think LAX is one of the first airports to actually take it off-site. A lot of airports, as we'll get into, have kind of moved it to a central location within their terminal. And LAX has a sort of a unique footprint and situation, so they moved it to a separate site entirely. So I was like, this sounds really cool, and I think it's something that I don't think has been that deeply explored. So I was actually kind of fascinated and was like really into it.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. I think it is or was and is the first airport that moved it off-site, as we highlighted in the report. Because, I think as we noted in the report, there's a lot of airports trying and testing different methods, but this was really the first one where it was literally, off-site. I think that was a good term that we used. And, I think what stood out to me most and kind of why, I guess what attracted me most to doing a report on this topic was just all of the media attention it got. And really it was really that first week was where I think most of the negative attention, I guess you would say, was on the airport and the system. And, there were a lot of stories after that, but it did seem like it turned into this huge issue. And I think generally, the media tends, I wouldn't say overblow things, but, it's sort of more in their best interest to kind of cover all of, kind of make it seem a lot scarier than it is. And I think even to this day, I'm curious to know what, you probably we both are here living in LA. What do you find people's impression of LAX, LAX and sort of the whole Uber and Lyft at LAX right now? Because it seems like even though the system, I took it the other day and it worked just fine, but it seems like the impression that it's made upon a lot of people is still kind of lingering negatively.
Yeah, and you're absolutely right. I think in the first couple weeks when it opened, it was sort of late October, early November, and I don't think all the infrastructure was in place, and it really got off to a bumpy start. I think there were waits of like 45 minutes to an hour for passengers, and people were posting online, as you mentioned, as we talked about. And so definitely, I think in some people's minds, they still have kind of a little bit of a negative image. Although a lot of others I've talked to have said, I just took it recently. It went very smoothly.
Yeah. Well, I think, if you've actually taken it recently, you know that it's pretty much all the kinks have been worked out for the most part at this point. I took it just the other day and it worked pretty well.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's certainly to their credit. I think the travel time pretty easy to manage. I think except for maybe holidays when right around Christmas.
Yeah.
Or probably if there's like a Memorial Day coming up, that's when things really get a little hectic. But beyond that, it seems to have been like kind of pretty quiet, and I guess no news is good news.
Yeah, definitely. So I think it is a 20-page. What I think it came in at over 20 pages. But if you could summarize it quickly, do you want to take a stab at summarizing the report for those who may not have read it yet?
Yeah. So the report is really an analysis of LAX, how it started. What happened in that, those first couple weeks, how LAX is set up, and then it looks at, a little bit about what other airports have done in this area in terms of their ride-hailing situations, and then it really goes into kind of an analysis and some recommendations about looking at really the deeper details. We talked about how the surface level was that people thought it got off to a bumpy start. Now it's been smoother. But there's a lot of other elements that maybe airports really haven't thought about. And so there's some lessons that perhaps airports can learn, both LAX and other airports around the country, that we made recommendations about.
Yeah, no, that's a perfect summary. I couldn't have said it better myself. You must have been one of the authors of this report, huh?
I think I was.
Yeah. And, I think one of the reasons why I personally kind of thought this topic was so important, it actually, I think while we were working on this report, I interviewed Meera Joshi, who used to be the NYC TLC commissioner, and she had recently released a report on basically all the different regulatory frameworks that cities around the world were using to regulate TNCs. And one of the things she said to me on that podcast that really stood out was the fact that there isn't a lot of knowledge sharing happening, right? It seems like a lot of these cities, especially cities, are often working in silos. And I think if you've ever worked at like a big private company like Uber or Lyft, like they're like half of their business is just like sharing information, right? They call it lessons learned. They develop a game plan for launching one market and then they go use that in other markets. And I felt like one of the, when I was interviewing her, that really stood out to me because that, we were working on this airport report at the time, and I'm thinking to myself, wow, LAX is going to go and do this huge system. And, people might read the media reports, but that really doesn't get into the granular level. Like, what are the actual products being used? What are the screens that drivers can see, that passengers are seeing? Like, what are, we included actual diagrams, pictures, everything like that. And so I know for me, it was really kind of about creating this report so that others could learn from it. Maybe they don't do the exact same thing. Maybe they take some elements, maybe they take no elements, but they at least know what options are out there and what's available. I don't know. How do you feel about that? And what do you think was kind of like the importance of this report?
Yeah, I think we're sort of two things. I think number one, airports, as you mentioned, are they have their own world. They may not be communicating all the time with other airports. And then the airports and TNCs, I know they're communicating, but there's certain things that I think they can continue to work on in terms of like what are other elements that can be used to optimize the system. And we touched on a bunch of those in our report. And then, part two of that is we're sort of in the very early stages of this phase where airports are starting to manage the curb a little more strictly. Mm-hmm. And so some airports have made the change to restricting pickup locations for TNCs. Others have not. So we're in this really early phase, and LAX is in some ways at the forefront of this and what it did. And so hopefully this can be something that can be looked at and a little more deeply by other airports, and hopefully this report helps do that.
Yeah, definitely. And that is one thing that stood out to me is that obviously, the airports and TNCs are working closely on this. But I think one of the reasons why I wanted to do this report, because I knew that there would be some things that we could really, like based off my experience working with drivers and, kind of understanding that side of the equation, that I felt like be able to provide some unique insight and value. And, we won't give away the whole report on this podcast. There's 20 pages, so I don't even know if we could, if we had a few hours. But I think that we were having conversations at one point with the airport officials, and they were describing this situation to me where they just didn't understand what was happening in the LA exit lot because there were no Uber cars there, and there were a bunch in the staging lot. And I thought to myself, wow, I can actually see what the queue looks like from the Uber driver app. I can see what the surge is like. And so I have all this information as a driver, but if I would have been sitting there with airport officials at that moment, in the moment, I could have probably figured out what was going on and what needed to happen. So it's just interesting to me to see that, I'm sure that there's some sharing going on, but it seemed like in that instance, airport officials had less information than like actual Uber and Lyft drivers, which is just crazy to me.
Yeah, and you mentioned, I think, one of the recommendations in the report is to really increase that, data sharing. Mm-hmm. We talked about, how TNCs can sometimes nudge behavior by charging different rates. And how that might cause people to flex different services. So if airport officials, can work with TNCs like on a minute-by-minute basis to say, hey, maybe you thought about doing this, what about doing this, to sort of affect behavior, then hopefully the system can even work even better, especially even during those, really busy times of year like Thanksgiving and Christmas when things are at their peak.
Yeah, no, that's a good point, because I think that, the airport folks are really good at their job and, sort of the operations of running the airport. Like if you put me in charge of the airport, it would probably be a total disaster from day one, hour one, right? But so it's kind of understandable that they may not be experts in the TNC side of thing and just really kind of understanding the wide array of products that are available. I know that that we included another example, this is kind of what we call nudging, is that, in certain trips in LA, basically all over, Lyft and Uber will, in certain, if certain triggers happen, for example, if you call for an UberX or a Lyft, and maybe it's surge pricing so that the price is close to the ride, the price of a Lux ride, for example, which is their premium tier, which may not be surging at that time. They'll sort of nudge you and say, hey, it's only $20 more if you want to ride in style and take a Lux. And so that was sort of, that's a product that's already available on both the Uber and Lyft apps. So you could imagine, right, if airport officials know about those types of products and they go to Uber and Lyft and say, hey, we already know you guys are using this product. Let's use it in this situation in Thanksgiving where we don't want to go crazy and send everyone to the LAX a lot. Let's try and do a little more curbside pickups, for example, right?
Yeah, exactly. And we looked at Rematch, which is a program that can match when drivers come to the curb and drop someone off, and then they can immediately match with someone they could pick up. And that might be a way to, number one, make the system more efficient, but also they can probably pick someone up within the terminal area. And so one of the things we're really looking at is what could LAX do or other airports do to keep some of this traffic flow in terminal and still achieve their goals of reducing congestion. And I think there's certain ways of doing so that are sort of maybe weren't highlighted by the media and all that frenzy of attention at the first opening of LA Exit, but I think going forward in the longer term, there's a lot of things that they can look at to optimize their system.
Yeah. And I know that, I think that you and I chatted, a lot about basically kind of almost balancing each party's inputs, right? I mean, you sort of have, who are the various constituents in this case? I guess there's the airport and Uber and Lyft, passengers and drivers.
Yeah, you have the airport, which has its own goals. A lot of time it's reducing congestion, but also the passenger experience. You have Uber and Lyft and their interest in obviously moving cars around and hopefully making a profit. And then you have the drivers who don't want to be sitting and queuing in line forever. And then the passengers who kind of want an efficient experience and a safe one. So each one has their own sort of, there's some overlapping goals, but each one has kind of distinct perspectives.
Yeah. And I think that's sort of one of the goals, we had in the report is really to basically take in all of those inputs from the different constituencies and then find that middle ground where it kind of, a solution might make the most sense for the most number of those constituents, or it might really help achieve, the airport's number one goal and be somewhat important to Uber and Lyft. And, so it was nice that, I think you can talk maybe a little bit more about the people we interviewed, but, we were able to basically interview all of the important constituents. And I think that gave a lot of, kind of balance and nuance to the report too.
Yeah, I think we got a good variety of perspectives. I know we talked to board officials from LAX. We talked to Juan Matute, who's from UCLA Institute of Transportation Studies, Greg Rogers, who works for Securing America's Energy Future, or Future Energy, and he works in kind of the transportation technology sector. And then we also spoke with people from Lyft and Uber to kind of understand their perspective and what are the technology elements that the airport might take a look at.
Yeah. And I know Lyft actually, to their credit, they released that blog post kind of all about airports basically. And I thought that actually had, I hadn't read that blog post. We can link to it in the show notes if people are interested, but I hadn't read that blog post, and it really kind of highlighted a lot of their thinking behind, airports and sort of what they're trying to do, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And they had some kind of important insights about, what can work and what doesn't. We did highlight in the report trying to increase, shared rides within the terminal area, so that we're sort of furthering sort of environmental goals and such, and that might work. On the other hand, Lyft pointed out that sometimes it can get a little messy when you're trying to match up multiple people, different terminals. So there's a lot of logistics that I think really worked out.
Yeah, no, that was actually one thing that I hadn't really thought about much, and to kind of dig deep on that, basically I believe what Bakari Brock at Lyft told us was that for their matching algorithm, right, in the past when they were doing curbside pickup, there were 6 terminals, and so if they were doing shared rides, they would have 5 or 6 distinct pickup points, right, which doesn't work all that great for shared rides, versus now with the PIN system and the LA exit lot, they have one pickup point, and so you can imagine like all those passengers who were in 5 spots before are now in 1 spot, and so it makes their shared ride matching algorithm a lot more effective. That was kind of the gist of what they said, right?
Yeah, exactly. And then the other element is that the use of rematch is actually declined when you take pickups off the curb of an airport, because there's just less efficiency in finding that next ride. And so that's something for airports to take a look at, because if someone's already in the terminal for a drop-off, they're gonna go through the rest of the terminal on their way out. And so it really makes sense for them to try at least pick up another passenger instead of having to go to yet another off-site facility. It's a little more efficient to just do it all in one fell swoop if they're already there anyways. So that's one main lesson.
Yeah, and that's always been, features like Rematch, I think, are features that I love to highlight to people because, there are obviously a lot of positives and negatives to TNCs, but something like that I think is clearly beneficial. Whereas in the past, with a taxi stand, for example, or, other, even, before they even had this feature, it was just sort of like wasted space, wasted efficiency. And now it's like an actual technological benefit that you're getting, right? People talk like, oh, technology, makes everything more efficient, and I think often they're kind of full of it, but this is actually a concrete example of where technology is helping, especially drivers. They love it. So that is one feature. I know you and I think both felt pretty strongly that Rematch feature is something we would like to see, LAX look at again, or definitely other airports at least kind of consider it and really figure out if there's a good way they can use that in the future.
Yeah, exactly. It also goes to certain situations. One of the things that I think that the airports can still look at is kind of like the passenger experience, and that Rematch, especially in certain times when people aren't necessarily going to want to go all the way to LAX if it's raining or it's cold, doesn't come off airplanes and they're dressed in T-shirts and shorts and they're not necessarily going out in the elements. And so
Yeah.
that's true of LA, but it's doubly true of other airports and most of the rest of the country that have more extreme weather swings. And so thinking through those situations where you'd want to have a curbside pickup is something that airports, I think, are going to still need to think about.
Yeah, definitely. No, I think that we are pretty lucky living in LA with the good weather and all of that. We get to take advantage of that. So, I think it is, you bring up a few good points, right? That there are these sort of edge cases. I think I noted that, as someone now, I've got a family, right? And I know you've got kids too. And when you travel with kids, like if I had to take the LA exit, man, that would be a nightmare with kids.
Yeah.
Especially since, you often have the smart cart where you have to load up the luggage and the car seats and everything. And it still seems like it would be quite a hassle.
Yeah, exactly. And so, especially if you could use some shared algorithm, if you as a family were coming off a plane, 2 or 3 people, that could be effectively the shared ride. So there would only need to be one additional stop for the vehicle leaving the airport, and that would seem to be more efficient. So I think there's certain cases that airports should take a look at, shared rides, or people are willing to pay more for a kind of a more white glove experience that they can kind of get picked up at the curb.
Yeah. And I think the other big thing that I observed from doing this research and writing this report is that transition period matters a lot. I think we did a good job kind of highlighting how LAX, they started, I believe they started on a Tuesday. So, the slowest day of the week, basically, and there weren't any big holidays coming up, but still they did move over all of their services, so that's UberX, Lyft, Uber Pool, Lyft Shared, and even the kind of mid-tier luxury, right? The Uber Select, and Lyft, whatever their equivalent is, I think Lyft Premium or whatever it is. They moved all of them over all at once. And so I feel like that could have been a little more staggered. And I think that just in general, whenever you test something new, you kind of want to do a pilot, or you want to, start small so that if there are issues, 100% of the users don't have to experience it, right?
Yeah, exactly. And I think they definitely ran into a few bumps. I think they kind of it sort of developed pretty rapidly in terms of their adjustments.
Mm-hmm.
But when they first started, there was really not a lot of protection from the elements. So I think that's something that airports could consider for the future, and also more communication about what the passenger is going to experience. Because if you're a passenger getting off an airplane and you have to take a shuttle to get to the slot, and that you might get a ride at some point, that creates a lot of uncertainty, and that tends to be the enemy of people using the service. So I think at the beginning, more communication, but also even now, where I think one of our recommendations was to create a real-time passenger updates through an app, so someone getting off a plane can take a look at the app and say, hey, I'm going to be able to get to the LA exit lot in 7 minutes and then get a ride 2 minutes later. So it'll be a 10-minute wait, whereas right now, I believe that they really don't have a good passenger get off plane.
Yeah, or even, sure. I mean, I guess it's Yeah, I mean, it's sort of similar, right, to like checking the boards at the airport. You see when the plane's landing, where your baggage is going to go. If they had some digital signage, I don't think we got too in depth on this, but maybe these are, further recommendations right now, but some sort of digital signage. Because, I know when I flew into Southwest the other day, and that's Terminal 1, I did take a picture of a sign that I think was pretty new, but it did say that LAX at Walt Lot was only a 3-minute walk. And so you could kind of imagine, if you're walking out and you don't have a ton of luggage or you don't have kids, or anything like that, 3-minute walk in the 70-degree sun is really not too bad, and then you're right there. You don't have to wait for a shuttle. It's I would say if you're flying into Terminal 1 at LAX, it's actually quite I would say it's a lot more convenient than it used to be.
Yeah, and it really is pretty close to the terminal area. It's about as close as you can be without actually being in the central terminal. And the other thing, to their credit, is they did have a plan to sort of adjust.
Yeah.
They purchased an additional lot and had that open within, I think, 2 weeks of LAX at initially opening. And so and then they put up, umbrellas, and so they made a pretty quick and smooth adjustment, which is to their credit.
Yeah. So do you think, was there one really big takeaway that you had for, I guess, cities, regulators, airports, if they were looking at this whole situation in our report, like what's the one thing you think they could implement for the biggest success, or really the most bang for your buck?
Yeah, I think taking a look at combining the technology with policy decisions. So we talk a lot in the report about how to encourage, both shared rides, but also if people want to pay for white glove treatment to allow that. And so utilizing services like Rematch to be able to make that happen is, I think, hopefully the ideal situation. So I think airport officials looking at those two things together is key.
Yeah, I know. I was surprised to find out that Uber Black, what was it? I believe the drop off, they get charged a $5 fee, but there's no charge for pickup. And Uber X is actually a $4 drop off fee and $4 pickup fee. So it's actually, the cost of the ride is more for Uber Black, but the airport fees charged are actually cheaper on Uber Black than they are on Uber X. And Uber Black, you get picked up curbside, right?
Yeah, so that's that's right, and that's another thing that airports can take a look at in terms of pricing the curb, and I think that's another lesson that they really should look at. Hey, what is the ideal rate? What are we trying to achieve? Where are these funds going to be used?
Yeah.
And to kind of manage the curb like other cities are starting to look at too.
Yeah, because I think the ideal goal for a lot of cities and airports is some future of dynamic pricing and congestion pricing. But even, I guess when you look at static pricing, right, like there really isn't any reason an Uber Black should be paying less than an Uber X. I would say if anything, they should be paying, 2 or 3 times more. That's what the cost of the ride is. And, sort of using those fees to, either subsidize some sort of shared activity or, some sort of other equitable activity, I guess.
Yeah, exactly right. And I think there's definitely more work to be done. And I think looking at exactly what the fees should be and what why are they this much versus a different price is something that I think airports can continue to look at, because I think they were set for taxis and for limousines, and then I don't know if they've quite adjusted to kind of the age of Uber and Lyft yet.
Yeah, no, I think we definitely highlighted a few examples of sort of, I guess I would call it like obtuse pricing, right? Because there's also the shared aspect where you don't really, the fees are actually more for shared, right? Because if you have 2 people sharing a ride in one car, you're paying double than a single person in Uber X. So I think there's definitely some further optimization that can be done there. And I mean, I know you actually, we released this report a few weeks ago, but then this story popped up at the Phoenix airport. I mean, fees are a big issue right now, because I think a lot of cities and even airports sort of see Uber and Lyft, I wouldn't say as a cash cow, but I think that they see that, too much of Uber and Lyft can be a bad thing, and they kind of want to tax them or charge them higher fees to pay for some of the city services they're using. So I know, do you want to briefly touch on that Phoenix situation?
Yeah. Up until recently, I think it was just $2.66 to pick up at Phoenix Airport, and then they recently, at least the Phoenix City Council, tried to increase the fees to $4 for drop-off and $4 for pickup. And I know both Uber and Lyft protested that and were threatening to pull out, and right now it's kind of the decision's on hold. But it's definitely something that I think is going to be kind of a continuing issue at different airports, both because of the congestion and managing the curb space, but also because airports are seeing less people drive and park, which is actually a big source of revenue for them. And so I think they're trying to figure out, how do we make sure we support the customer experience? This is the service people want to use. At the same time, we're worried about our revenue.
Yeah.
I think it's a delicate balance.
Yeah, I guess I get it from the airport's perspective. If 80 to 90% of trips are UberX and Lyft Classic, that's probably the fee that they care most about. And they probably, it may not even be worth the fight to fight over Uber Black or, Uber Pool even, for example. But I do think these fees, you touched on it. I mean, what were the three? I think there were 2 or 3 macro trends that we highlighted in the report, like the challenges. I think one of the things in releasing this report, I think that every airport out there is either already thinking about this, kind of like how to handle some of these issues, or, with TNC specifically, or will have to in the future. What are a couple of the macro trends that we highlighted in the report as far as, like that decreasing parking revenue, construction and infrastructure and things like that?
Yeah, I think one is definitely, I think the decreasing decreasing parking revenue, which sort of is coming from a number of angles, but definitely Uber and Lyft are part of that, since people obviously aren't parking.
I mean, I think it's probably a big part of that, right?
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely significant. I think the other aspect is figuring out how to manage congestion. I think there's just more and more volume of passengers at airports.
Yeah.
So even aside from Uber and Lyft, airports are getting more crowded. They're usually the same size. It's very difficult to change the shape of an airport after it's built.
Yeah.
And so figuring out how to manage the congestion, and then I would say number 3 is, and one that really hasn't, there's still a lot of area to work with, is improving the passenger experience at the ground level. So everyone's focused on what's your experience in an airplane and maybe right at the gate, but leading up to that, what's it like getting to the airport, getting out, figuring out where you're going. I think that's another area that I think you'll see airports spending more time on.
Yeah, because I mean, I can tell you, anecdotally, having talked to a lot of people here in LA, I've talked to, I would say several, if not dozens of people who told me, I only fly out of Burbank now, or I prefer flying out of Burbank, especially after the whole LA exit situation, right? And so, I mean, this could be, airports are sort of generally at a macro level seeing more and more passengers, but I think it could be, sort of a bad business for them too, right? If they don't really understand and focus on that customer on the ground experience, as you put it, right?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I think it's some airports are between a rock and a hard place. LAX has one of the smallest footprints relative to its volume anywhere in the world. So there's no doubt that it becomes a headache. But I think other airports are definitely going to have to think like, hey, this is a service that people want. How are we going to balance this versus other forms of transportation that are coming in, buses, trains, people driving themselves, other forms. And so I think that's going to be a tricky balance, because each place is a little different and they've never done it before. We're just sort of at the beginning stages of this period where the congestion has gotten to the point where they're having to think about moving the pickup point to other areas besides the curb.
Yeah, and I think I would add that this is really only a starting point, in my opinion. One trend that I've sort of seen, not exclusive to airports, but just generally in cities, is that Uber and Lyft, they're sort of an easy scapegoat for a lot of transportation issues, whether that's congestion or, the traffic at the airports or, bad drivers, whatever it may be. And I think that they're definitely partially responsible, but, sort of like getting rid of Uber and Lyft are not going to solve a lot of the systemic issues that are out there, whether it's airports or cities. And so I think that's what I also wanted to highlight with this report. It's not like, okay, let's just move Uber and Lyft away and then everything else, will work perfectly. And I think that's sort of what we're seeing. It's still like there are still going to be these, dynamic, we do still need to figure out a way to, for example, dynamically price the curb at some point in the future. So I think that this was a first step, but I do hope that there's a lot more that will be done next.
Yeah, that's right. People were going to the airport before Uber and Lyft were around, and now if they're taking a ride into the airport with Uber and Lyft, they're not really adding a new trip, like people would just previously just drive in themselves. So I think there's definitely value to what they're doing, and I think it's just a matter of communicating and planning the system enough that you can kind of reduce some of these headaches that to the extent you can, as best you can.
Yeah, cool. Well, I think that was a great summary of the report. Anything we missed?
No, just we're keeping our eye out on the airports around the country, so taking a look at what they'll do next.
Yeah, no, definitely. I mean, I guess the intended audience for this report, I don't know, who do you think it was? Airports, people generally, transportation folks in the industry, people that are sort of interested in these topics?
Yeah, I would say, I think certainly the airport officials who are going to be dealing with this, but also on the other side, Uber, Lyft, anyone dealing with, how airports manage congestion and the passenger experience. Hopefully there's some lessons or recommendations they can take with them.
Yeah, no, definitely. I know that's, I had a couple conversations with the LAX airport team in that week of when there was a lot of chaos and madness, and I was able to provide them a little advice and a little guidance. But I do feel like if they would have talked to me a few months earlier, it might have saved them some heartache and trouble. I don't know that it would have been the perfect cure, but I think definitely, as we highlighted in the report, there's definitely some opportunities still.
Yeah, absolutely, and hopefully we'll get ahead of it so the next time someone opens, they'll have some more of these tips and suggestions before they start it.
Yeah, and I think this one went pretty well. So we are taking suggestions for next areas of study. So if any of the listeners have any suggestions or topics that they're interested in seeing a nice policy report on, definitely feel free to reach out. Blair, if people want to follow your stuff, or what's the best place to follow you? I know you're on Twitter, LinkedIn. Where do you want them to go?
Yeah, Twitter. I'm just at Blair Schlecter. So my first and last name, and then on LinkedIn, also my just my full name to find my profile on my feed.
Cool. Yeah, we'll leave a link to both of those in the show notes because I've definitely misspelled your last name more than once before. And then if people are interested in checking out the report, we'll leave a link to that. As mentioned, it's called Congestion at the Curb, Analysis of Ride-Hailing at LAX and Recommendations to Optimize the TNC System at Airports. So, Blair, thank you very much for chatting and look forward to working on more projects in the future.
Thanks, Harry. My pleasure.